Hi, I'm Sam Hawley, coming to you from Gadigal Land. This is ABC News Daily. They dined over crab dumplings, fish and beef, washed it down with Russian wine. And Vladimir Putin and the North Korean leader, Kim Jong Un, toasted Russia's sacred struggle with the West in Ukraine. So, what deal did the leaders really do during a rare meeting in Russia? And how worried should we be about a new era in their relationship? Today, a defence strategist on what both nations are really after.
I'm Dr Samir Puri, and the author of a book called Russia's Road to War with Ukraine, a visiting lecturer in war studies at King's College London, and I'm joining you from Singapore.
Samir, Kim Jong Un, he arrived in Russia, stepped off the train onto a red carpet with a fair bit of pomp and ceremony.
So this is the elusive leader of the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, making his first trip outside of the Hermit Kingdom in years.
The North Korean leader, Kim Jong Un, is here. He has arrived to the...
So it's a big deal, just the fact he's left North Korea, but it's an even bigger deal that he's gone to his giant next-door neighbour, Russia, in pursuit of some sort of unspecified arms deal. So I think there's a couple of different levels as to why this is so significant.
Yeah, all right. And let's touch on those issues in a moment. But please, can we briefly mention his method of transport? It was, as we said, by train. And it was a pretty special train, wasn't it? Just tell me about this train.
Well, so famously, he travels by armoured train. He never seems to travel abroad by aeroplane. He went to China in 2019 on the same or a similar train. It's so heavily armoured that it travels very, very slowly.
So Kim Jong Un, he doesn't feel safe on passenger jets, we assume.
Well, he's going to be one of those people whose paranoia is probably justified,
Yes.
Given what a notorious character he is, what a notorious family dynasty he comes from, and the fact that they are at a unresolved state of war with South Korea since the 1950s, as everybody famously knows.
At the end of that very slow train trip, the North Korean leader ended up at the Vostochny Cosmodrome, which is in eastern Russia. That's where he met Vladimir Putin. It's a space centre.
A warm embrace for two leaders increasingly isolated on the world stage.
And Vladimir Putin indicated that Russia will help Pyongyang develop satellites.
After all, North Korea has tried and failed to launch two just this year. But for military experts, these launches are really about improving North Korea's intercontinental ballistic missile technology.
But, of course, it's believed this meeting was much more than just about space, wasn't it? It's about arms. It's about Russia's war in Ukraine. Samir, what do we know?
So what we know for 100% is that an advanced party of North Koreans met the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, and Sergei Shoigu has actually spoken to them. He's the Russian Defense Minister, so they've already, as with these giant international summit meetings, their lieutenants have already done the deal. Whatever has been agreed, presumably the US is very keen to monitor.
Russia's war in Ukraine. No nation on the planet, nobody, should be helping Mr. Putin kill innocent Ukrainians. And if they decide to move forward with some sort of arms deal, there will certainly be repercussions for North Korea, both.
And Mr. Kim, during his visit to Russia, described the war in Ukraine as a sacred fight. What else is going on here, do you think?
There's quite an unequal exchange that's going on. That's why the Biden administration are making quite a big deal of this. It's quite a worrying proposition because the weapons that Russia needs in its war effort in Ukraine are probably quite small caliber. quite literally. They may even be after things like artillery shells, spares for some of the vehicles that the North Koreans can offer. The North Koreans probably have a lot of Soviet-era military equipment that the Russians could use probably quite quickly. Now, the quid pro quo is the worrying part. North Korea is famous, of course, for firing its ballistic missiles in and around Japan, in and around South Korea. And they have a fairly embryonic, fairly underdeveloped nuclear weapons program, at least compared to the bigger nuclear weapon states. Russia is the possessor of the largest number of nuclear arsenal warheads in the world. It also has its own ballistic missile program. Is Kim Jong Un after an augmentation of his ballistic missile or, God forbid, his nuclear weapons program?
Yeah, gosh, that's a real concern. President Putin insists he fully complies with restrictions on discussing military matters with North Korea. But then, of course, he indicated that there's still room for talks. It's just not a one-way street, is it, Samir? As you indicated, Kim Jong Un will want a fair bit in return if he gives ammunition to Russia.
Yeah, well, when dictators meet, you can be pretty sure that all the pleasantries are part of greasing the wheels of what is going to be a sort of selfishly beneficial encounter. But I think the thing to really remember, when we talk about countries, for example, in Europe hitting 2% of their GDP on defense spending, I mean, North Korea famously spent about a quarter of its GDP on defense, and possibly even more. And as a result, its people have often starved. So there may also be just some quite general export needs that North Korea has that Russia might now be looking to furnish. And don't forget, Russia still has this natural energy that it can't sell to European countries, America, Australia, Japan, all the countries that have sanctioned it over its invasion of Ukraine.
We know, of course, Samir, that the US, Europe, Western allies have really isolated Russia in every way. You've mentioned the sanctions. Of course, also, they've provided huge amounts of weapons to Ukraine.
The first Australian Bushmasters are on their way to Ukraine following a request from the country's president to help fight Russia's invasion.
The US will now supply Patriot missiles.
It's a defensive weapon system. It's not escalatory, it's defensive.
The United States has confirmed it will send cluster bombs to Ukraine.
US officials argue the controversial weapons are needed to push back Russian forces along the front lines.
So, Samir, given that Western backing for Ukraine, how important is it that Vladimir Putin gets more weapons to achieve his aims? And what other nations is he turning to?
Right, so Putin has lost his access to the West, clearly, to Australia, to Japan. Even Singapore has introduced a degree of sanctions. But as I mentioned, he has found that Russia can still trade very happily with enormous amounts of countries in Asia and Africa, India, China, South Africa, all manner of other countries who don't really buy the Western line on this war in Ukraine. Some countries have seen a degree of Western double standards over the years. That means that they're more willing to turn a blind eye to Russia. But in terms of what North Korea can offer, North Korea could be one of the very small number of countries that actively helps Russia's war effort.
Yes.
So that's a different thing. It's one thing to buy Russia's oil, indirectly helping its war effort. It's another thing to give Russia arms, which you can imagine that the Iranians have done this to the extent that they could. The Syrians have been very supportive, and there's North Korea. So really, Putin has been scraping the bottom of the international barrel to find countries that will actively support the war effort. One other quick detail on this is the US intelligence services were very keen a number of months ago to point out that the Wagner Russian paramilitary group, which did a lot of the fighting, as you know, in Bakhmut in East Ukraine, had done some private deals with North Korea to procure North Korean weapons for the Russian war effort. So there's probably already some North Korean weapons, ammunition making its way to the Ukrainian war zone.
And Samir, what about China? Because China calls Russia its no-limits partner, but it certainly hasn't, at this stage, been shipping any weapons off to Russia, has it?
Right. This has been the source of an enormous degree of public consternation by the Americans, who've said, China, don't you dare start selling Russia weapons to use in its war in Ukraine. And I think the publicly available information suggests that while China has supplied certain things that could be helpful, it hasn't really crossed into the threshold of outright large-scale arms sales. And I think what we should be really looking out for is that Russia and China have already been embarking on these joint naval patrols, joint, sea voyages in and around the Kuril Island, north of Japan. Could North Korea, not necessarily as a naval power, but just as a very heavily militarized power, want to buy into this cooperative military work between China and Russia at a different level? Is that something that we might see in the near future? Because if that is the case, then we've actually got three quite heavily militarized states, each in their own way, cooperating quite closely, three clear dictatorships as well, might find a lot of common cause and identifications.
Yes, because there's some analysts that say Putin is making an axis of autocrats. Is this, Samir, about making an anti-Western alliance?
Do you know, I take a less alarmist line on this, because if we were having this conversation 30 years ago when the West was undisputed world king, and I just mean that there weren't really any other pretenders to America's dominance, it's very different to having this conversation in 2023. The world is increasingly a less Western-centric place. So if within that the Russians, the Chinese and the North Koreans find, more common identification, then we should also remember that Russia is trading very heavily with India, and there's all sorts of things going on where the West isn't really a part of it and might look with a little degree of concern. But I think all this really comes down to the fact that navigating global politics today, it's a very different art, I think, than that was required in the 90s and the early 2000s.
So, Samir, what does this all add up to for Russia on the battlefield? These alliances, can they actually make a difference to how the war actually plays out, do you think?
Well, it's a really good question, because the war in Ukraine has settled into this sort of sludge fest where the Ukrainian counteroffensive has under-delivered. The Russians have held their line in terms of the 17 or 18% of Ukrainian territory that they've occupied. And the Russian strategy really is to outlast the Ukrainians and outlast the Western support, especially the American support that the Ukrainian war effort depends upon. So this North Korean axis of possible weapons procurement is really part of that strategy for Russia, which is to dig in, to outlast. And the real moment, I think, of decision is who gets elected into the Oval Office in the next US election. So next year, do we see a Republican, Trump or somebody else, who just doesn't want to write billion-dollar checks to the Ukrainian armed forces because they don't think it's worth it? I would be enormously worried if I was a Western backer of Ukrainian victory in this war.
Dr Samir Puri is a visiting lecturer in war studies at King's College London and the author of Russia's Road to War with Ukraine. This episode was produced by Nell Whitehead, Bridget Fitzgerald and Anna John, who also did the mix. Our supervising producer is David Cody. Over the weekend, catch This Week with James Glenday. He'll be looking at the Australian homes that are becoming uninsurable. I'm Sam Hawley. ABC News Daily will be back again on Monday. Thanks for listening.
Subscribe to listen to more free podcasts or download the ABC Listen app and stream ad-free.